Let me see. I'm actually going to try and turn off these lights back here. There we go. Okay, so of course we're doing Brazil today. Very exciting. One of our two case studies in Latin America. The other one having been Mexico, which was last week. I'll spend a minute going over the quiz questions from the Mexico quiz, and then we'll dive right in here. There we are, beautiful. Okay. So, did anyone have any questions about Mexico? One of the interesting things, if you sort of break down the case studies that we do by region, what you'll find is that in the Americas, almost always, you're dealing with a presidential system. And Brazil is, of course, no exception to this, as you all know. So, just an interesting thing to note. There are obviously there's a paucity of presidential systems elsewhere in the world. Really, the Americas are the home of the presidential system, in part a legacy of their closeness to the United States, on whom many of them modeled their initial constitutional arrangements, and so they sort of inherited the presidential system from their northern neighbors. As we're going to see, Brazil had a slightly different path to independence and then to a republic than did its other Latin American neighbors. So it's going to be a very interesting day. I'm looking forward to sharing this with all of you. So I'll first go over the answers to the quiz from last week, the Mexico quiz. The Brazil quiz is already up for those of you who are interested. It is up and ready. So, question number one. The territory of present-day Mexico was colonized for centuries by which European power?
Spanish.
Yes, indeed, the Spanish. What was the Spanish? With Latin America, it's pretty easy, right? It's pretty easy there. It's Spain 90% of the time. True or false? Mexico is a unitary state, not a federal one. False. False. Mexico is a federal state. Mexico is a federal state. Remember, I told you that after you leave this class and you're going to be avidly studying all of the other case studies that we didn't get a chance to look at. Because I believe we only have one more case study, correct? I believe, yes, Nigeria. Next week, Nigeria is our final case study. And then the week after that is a wrapping up time, and we're going to go through some terms in the glossary, the bolded words that I think are very important. Then we're going to kind of bounce around and take a look at some things that, like the Gulf monarchies, how do those work, for example? Just kind of hitting some of the cases we didn't see. But to my point here, when you pull up your map and you take a look at it, and you see that it's a very mountainous country, very oftentimes you're going to be looking at a federal state. The state building process is going to be very, very difficult for one central unifying authority. So they're going to have to make deals with local notables who eventually become the local governors, and that's essentially how you can usually, very, very oftentimes, you're looking at a federal state and you have a very large, especially if you have a very large mountainous region. Mexico's legislative election system is best described as which of the following? Was it single-member proportional, single-member majority, mixed member, or strictly proportional? It was mixed member. And if you recall, this is the one that a lot of people copied from Germany. And just to review, because this will be on the final exam, I think it's one of the most difficult systems to grasp intuitively, but it actually makes really good sense when you think about it, is you have, let's just make it easy, and say that you have 10 seats up for grabs in single-member districts. Single-member districts. Okay? And when you get your ballot here, typically, they're all set up slightly differently. You'll have your list of candidates. And then you'll have your list of parties. And you'll be asked to pick one candidate and then pick one party. And at the end of the election, they'll add up all the individual district winners. And let's say we have a party called the BBB. I'm just making up a party here. The BBB, their guys won 4 elections. They won 4 of these single-member district elections. So they've captured 4 seats right off the bat. But when we look at how their party did, they actually won 50% of the vote. So they won 4 single-member district races, but 50% of the people who voted picked their party as their party of choice. And so what they'll do then is they'll add another seat to the BBB's total. Okay? And oftentimes what this amounts to is they'll add another seat. So in our micro example here, we have a 10-seat Congress, but the way the election, when it didn't match up quite perfectly, they're going to add another seat and give it to the BBB, so the BBB would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats. And that's what it looks like. And it's really quite an ingenious system. Not to prejudice you against other types of systems, but I do find it to be a highly rational way of doing things. And of course, it was the Germans who came up with that. Go figure. Very rational fellows. So, all right. Okay. So, yes, mixed member. Very good. Question number 4 was also true or false? True or false? Mexico's national legislative body is bicameral. What does bicameral mean? What does it mean if your legislature is bicameral?
Like 2 separate branches, like we have a house.
2 houses. Yeah, 2 houses or 2 chambers, 2 bodies. Yes, yes. And so is Mexico's national legislative body bicameral? It is indeed. And interestingly, just so you know, I'm not going to put this on the exam. I'm not out to get you guys. But just so you know, at the federal state levels, at the state level, they're all unitary. I'm very curious. At the federal level, at the national level, they're all it's bicameral. But then when you go down to the individual federal states, they're all unicameral. So very interesting. Currently a 3-party system. It's a little bit complicated. Like Japan and India, Mexico experienced much of the institutionalization of its politics over a lengthy period of one-party rule in the 20th century. In the case of Mexico, it was ruled by which of the following parties that did this? Was it the LDP, the PRI, the INC, or the SPD? The PRI, yes, indeed it was. It was. Who can tell me the LDP? Who is the LDP? This was a quiz question going all the way back to like week 3. This was Japan's Liberal Democratic Party. They were basically the one party who dominated Japan's politics until like the 90s, I think is when they lost their first election. And then the INC was the party of, they always use abbreviations. The INC was the Indian National Congress Party. They were going to dominate India's politics for decades. And then with the SPD, which they weren't one of, they ruled in partnership with the CDU in Germany. And of course the SPD, fun trivia if you're ever on Jeopardy or something like that, it is the oldest social democratic party. It was created way back in like the 1870s. So it was initially made illegal by Bismarck. But anyway, there you go. So that was the quiz over Mexico. Do we have any questions about Mexico before we move on to Brazil? Okay, wonderful. Anyone here been to Brazil? Know anyone from Brazil? Yeah. When I was in school here, one of my classmates had grown up in Brazil. He was a mission kid. So their family lived in Brazil. He spoke phenomenal Portuguese. Of course, they speak Portuguese in Brazil because Brazil was a colony of Portugal. So which I don't know if I mentioned that previously, but if not, you will see that very soon here. So, let's do it. I'm going to erase this. The Americas, presidential systems. Okay, let's do it. From the beginning, Brazil. Some really cool stuff here. Oh, I forgot I had my laser pointer. I made sure to tuck it in the bag today. Old boy was messing with the cats earlier. I managed to grab it. Okay. So, all right. I'm going to stand over here actually, so I can point at things without interrupting your view. Right up here, the Amazon rainforest. Of course, one of the great providers of the world's oxygen there, a great deal of biodiversity. What to do with Brazil is, with the rainforest is a hot topic in Brazilian politics, because agribusiness would really like to expand more into the Amazon basin area, but there are rules and regulations preventing that, and it's a hot button issue there, and of course there's illegal logging that goes on there. There's also a lot of indigenous tribes who live in that area whose rights are supposed to be protected under the Constitution. Actually, when we get to Brazil's Constitution, we will see that it's very unlike our own. Has anyone read the American Constitution in here? Or read parts of it? It's like 20 pages long. Yeah, that's very much what you find in constitutions that were written in, say, the 19th century. If you look at a constitution that was written more recently, last 20, 30 years, you'll find that there's all sorts of stuff in there that you don't find in the classical constitutions. We'll look at that. This is an illustration of, he was playing with the cats all day with this. I wonder if it's dying. Carnival, right down there. It's dying. Here he is. That's Jesus overlooking the city. It is by population, it is the largest Catholic country in the world. Although evangelicals have made tremendous headway in Brazil over the last about 25 years. They went from being about 8% to about 30%. In 20 years. I mean, that's incredible growth. Actually, they're projected to surpass the Catholic population of Brazil by the end of this decade. So quite incredible, quite incredible. There's over 200 million people in Brazil, so it is the largest Catholic country by population. Pop quiz, can anyone tell me what is the world's largest Muslim country by population?
It's enough, right?
Anybody? Indonesia. Quite curious. No? Yes, indeed. Very curious. It is, yes, yeah. It's actually a big hot button issue in their politics because you have people who don't like that it's a big tourist destination. You have the women walking around in like bikinis and stuff, and the government's like, but you guys, this is where tons of our revenue come from. We want these tourists to come here. But you have religious conservatives who are growing more and more powerful within the government who are saying, no, we don't care. You're not going to do that. So it's very interesting. And then this is the Congress building, very cool building there, in the capital, which is Brasilia. Yes.
Is France getting up there or no?
In terms of the percentage of the population, they do. They have the largest Muslim population of any country in Europe, for sure. And there are historical reasons for that, just because of their policies in places like what's today Syria, and then especially in Algeria. So yeah, they do have the largest population of Muslim people in Europe. Although Germany is getting up there too, because Germany's are recent. France's have been there for many decades. I mean, this really goes all the way back to decolonization. Germany didn't have any colonies to be decolonized from. So a lot of the people who came to France at that point had been colonial subjects of France and who had moved up there after the decolonization period and the Algerian War in the 1960s. Germany's all are very recent, really post-Iraq War II. So from like 2002, 2003, when the Bush administration started blowing up the Middle East and causing all of these refugees to come streaming towards Europe, blowing up Syria, destroying Libya, and then a lot of them wound up in Germany. So that's how Germany got up there. So different ways there, but yes, France does. So really, I could have put there's Brazil is a massive country, but these are some of the sites that you can see. If you go there, of course, the two biggest cities are Rio de Janeiro and Brasilia. So Very cool flag. Very cool flag. I know you all think I'm crazy for flags, and it's true to an extent. I am, but it's because flags can tell you so much about a country and the values that it aspires to. And the Brazilian flag is a wonderful case in point here. So at the bottom here, what we have is the old flag of the Brazilian Empire. Now I'll talk about what the Brazilian Empire was, just to show you. This was the original, well, not the original. This was the flag of the Brazilian Republic. And so they adopted the green field and yellow rhombus, which were basically a product of the Portuguese monarch, Pedro I, Emperor of Brazil, and the yellow represented his Habsburg way. So that's where the green and the yellow come from. So it is a product of Brazil's colonial past. But they got rid of the monarch's symbol here, and they put this here. So this is really cool. So this blue disc is meant to depict a starry night sky, okay? And this blue circle, this is supposed to be, and I'm not an astronomer, I don't know, but I take their word for it that very smart people put this together. This is supposedly the star, the arrangement of the constellations that you would have seen if you were looking up at the night sky in Rio de Janeiro on November 15th, 1889, as the Republic was being founded. Pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff. And the reason it wasn't in Brasilia is because that city hadn't really been created yet. That's a product of the 20th century. So they're in Rio de Janeiro, looking up, seeing skies. That's what that's from. And then right here, the motto: order and progress. Order and progress. And this comes from Auguste Comte. And he's someone who blue. Yes, I grabbed a blue one today. Auguste Comte, who had a philosophy known as positivism. Positivism. And there's actually a box here in this chapter about positivism. If you recall, they briefly mentioned it, and I almost talked about it last week in Mexico, because the late 19th century technocrats who were working for the El Presidente in that system, they were very much inspired by Comtean positivism as well. And I'm going to read you this box here. You can find it on 396. It's very interesting. It was a very, very influential political philosophy in the late 19th century in Latin America. So, its slogan was order and progress, and it held that humanity can and will progress by rejecting theology and abstract speculation in favor of the scientific study of nature and of society. It advocates a building blocks approach of empirical observation and data gathering. By assembling the blocks, society can thereby be analyzed, predicted, and then improved, not in a revolutionary way, but gradually, and under the supervision of quote-unquote humanitarian specialists. According to Comte, one of his famous expressions was, progress is the development of order. That it is by virtue of our more rational organization of things that is progress. Comtean positivism launched modern social science. It still holds great sway in the academy, of course, and it took root especially in Brazil. By the 1880s, many Brazilian army officers had been instructed in positivism by imported teachers who taught at the military academy. And then in 1889, when the Republic is founded, the positivists put their motto onto the Brazilian flag, Ordem e Progresso. So very, very interesting there. So that's where that comes from. Very, very cool flag here. So. Just a moment here. Sorry, I had to do a lot of talking today. Okay. So, Latin America. If you're interested in going back and taking a look at the stuff that I'm about to talk about, of course, as in all the chapters, he starts off with several paragraphs about the back history of Brazil before launching into the institutions. 393, 394, 395, 396. So I'm basically going to zip through the periods here. I'll come back to this in just a second. I just want to show you where we're going to go. I'm going to first talk about the 1763 to 1822 period, and then I'll talk about the 1822 to 1888 period. So that's how I'm going to break that up there. And I'm just going to pull this map back up so that we can see this here. So Latin America in 1800. So Latin America, the Napoleonic Wars are going on, right? So everything's being disrupted in France. Though, if you look at the time period, 1800, Napoleon has not yet made the fateful decision to depose the Spanish monarch, to invade the Iberian Peninsula, which is what's going to really destabilize the situation in Latin America. If you'll recall, what happened there was he basically takes the Bourbon kings off the throne of Spain and puts his brother on there. And the local notables here in the Spanish possessions say, well, boys, now's our chance. Let's go for it. We don't know this guy any loyalty. Let's do it. We're not rebelling against God and king. These are just some French commoners. You know, they're dogs. We don't have to listen to them. In the Viceroyalty of Brazil, you'll see, oh, it's Viceroyalty. The Viceroyalty of Brazil. It had been organized this way. The Viceroyalty of Brazil, it had been organized this way, right here. And what happens here is in 1805, 1806, instead of hanging out and waiting to be captured by the French, the British convinced the Portuguese monarch to get on one of its many ships and to flee. And to go to its largest, most prosperous colony, Brazil, and to wait out the war there. Now, Brazil and England go way back. I believe their Treaty of Alliance goes all the way back to like 1300 or something like that. It's like, and it's still in force. Portugal and Great Britain, they've been allies for like 800 years. It's interesting. Remember, the Pope back in the 1490s, when Columbus had started, quote unquote, discovering all of these islands over here, the Pope said, "Oh, hold on, guys. Instead of fighting over it, we're just going to draw a line here. Treaty of Tordesillas." And he says, everything to the left of the line, Spain. Everything to the right of the line, Portugal. So the Portuguese say, well, you know, golly, I guess we'd better just keep working on our trade routes. Remember, the Portuguese had started by going down the coast of Africa, rounding the Cape, going up into the Indian Ocean, and they dominate that Indian Ocean trade for a couple of centuries, really, until the British start really dominating. They basically ignore Brazil. It's this dense, forested area that's really mountainous, and you can't really get in there. You know, it's very difficult to settle and to populate. Not like all these islands, and you know, look how narrow Central America is there. What prompts the Portuguese government to start settling the area with its noble landowners and setting up the Viceroyalty of Brazil, where they granted large tracts of land to loyal nobility, similar to the Spanish model, is that, as you can see here, the French and Dutch start poking around. Imperial competition. As you can see, we have Dutch Guiana, French Guiana. They were poking around in this area, and the British and the Portuguese realized we really need to start populating this area with people who we can rely on to defend it against other imperial powers. And so that's what really, in the early 1700s, prompts this settlement movement. It's very much along the same lines as the Spanish. That is, you give a grant of land to a noble, maybe the second son of a noble or someone who isn't going to have land back in Portugal. It's a very small country, Portugal, very small state. The second son goes there, he gets a large plantation. What they were interested in there was sugar. Brazil did not have a lot of native labor force there. And so Brazil actually winds up being, and I believe he references this on page, where is it? Yes, page 394, he talks about this here. Because of the very small population of Europeans and the very small indigenous population, and the fact that sugar was really the commodity that could be grown in large amounts there, Brazil winds up becoming the home of an overwhelming amount of the slaves who are taken from Africa. About half of them. It's estimated, and of course we're dealing with estimates here, a little inexact. They estimate about 10 million slaves were taken from Africa. They estimate that about 5 million wound up in Brazil. And the life of a slave on a sugar plantation was very, very short. It was difficult, and it was dangerous, and so that's one of the reasons you had to keep importing so many. So Brazil was actually the largest single destination for African slaves. Many more went to the Caribbean because you were also doing sugar production there in places like what today is Haiti, which was French Saint-Domingue. Only about 600,000 actually ever make it to the United States. But in the United States, the climate is better, the work is not quite as dangerous, and so what happened in the United States is they were able to reproduce their numbers, and that's how that population grew. So, but in Brazil, that's not what happened. So that's what's going on there. When Napoleon comes, the French king moves his court to Brazil. So instead of the notables, the local elites in the viceroyalty of Brazil revolting against royal authority back in Europe, like all their fellows were doing, instead, there's really no bloodshed at all. The Portuguese king shows up, all the nobles are like, "Oh, sire, so wonderful for you to join us here." And he sets up his court there, and they don't come back till, several years after the Battle of Waterloo. And so this is a trend that we're going to continue to see on sort of bloodless changes here. So what happens here is they elevate Brazil to the status of a kingdom. So you have kind of like a dual monarchy thing going on here. You have the Portuguese crown and the crown in Brazil. So what happens is the father, back to Portugal to rule, son stays in Brazil. His father allegedly in 1821, when they were parting ways, gave him advice. He said, "If Brazilian independence is ultimately to be inevitable, then you should lead it rather than fight it." And it reminds me of that quote from Louis Napoleon, who said, "If you march at the head of the forces of your day, they will carry you with them. If you march against them, they will overthrow you." So the idea is if you sense that the mood is toward independence, just go ahead and lead it. Just declare your independence from me, your dad, basically. So, and that is exactly what happens here. So, it becomes a kingdom in 1815. In 1821-22, the monarchy of Brazil. And this is what we call the Brazilian Empire. So, the viceroyalty period, viceroyalty of Brazil, right here. And then this is the period of the Brazilian Empire. So, I'll jump back here for you. So now we're in 1888, 1889. So, very early on, we're going to see something occur, which is going to become a pattern in Brazilian politics. By the mid-1830s, Dom Pedro has proven himself to be a very inept king, not a terribly good administrator. The army steps in. This is going to be a recurring feature of Brazilian politics until about, let's see, the last time they stepped out of politics in 84, 85, and they haven't stepped back in since. But you could count on periodic military interventions, coups, right? We call them coups, But in Brazil, the coups were a little bit different. Than they would be in the rest of Latin America. So I will get to that, but I just want to point out that very, very early on, it's just become an independent kingdom in 1815. It's been elevated to a kingdom. Now it's an independent kingdom here in 1822. Within a decade, the army is stepping in and saying, doing a terrible job, king. Doing a terrible job. We're going to boot you out of there. Now, his son, Dom Pedro's son, is still a child. So, a regency council is formed. And if you are a student of history, you know that whenever there is a child on the throne and a regency council is set up, that means it's a council of powerful individuals. Usually their mother will be on the council, maybe an uncle or something. It's going to be a very difficult period for your country, 9 times out of 10. And Brazil was no different. What they decided to do is disperse power among Brazil's many burgeoning states, which were largely set up along the lines of the land grants that had been made to these large nobles. So if you look on page 395, you'll see the basic state system here laid out. And it's not all that different from the administrative regions that had been initially created during the period of colonial rule there. This, in 1834, this is going on, and it essentially introduces a de facto federalism. The center is saying, okay, you guys are going to run your affairs. You are answerable to me, but we're going to let you go ahead and run your own affairs. Politics quickly becomes a series of quarrels among the states and the rich landowning families that run them. So again, these states are virtual fiefdoms of these individual powerful landowners. The instability is so serious that in 1840, just a few years later, they get together and decide to put Dom Pedro II, only 14 years old, on the throne in his own name, saying, you know what, this is going to lead to fragmentation. We did not study these other cases, but this happens very quickly in a lot of Central America and in these upper reaches here. There were actually very large states originally, large blocks. Originally, it did not look like all these small states, but you had these large states that were breaking up as these regionally independent notables started breaking away. And Brazil looked like it could do the same thing, just kind of fragment and fall apart. And so they voluntarily put the king on the throne in his own name, essentially to be there as a mediator of disputes among the nobles. So think of him as a broker. Think of him as a fixer, right? Guys are clashing, and you got to bring them together and say, okay, we're just going to hash this out, and you're both going to deal with what I decided here. So he's governing in conjunction with these large landowners. These were hacendados in the case of the Spanish. In Portuguese, it's fazendeiros. I think I'm saying that right. My Spanish and Portuguese are both dreadful. What's going on during this period, though, this is relatively successful. But what did I just say? I said that the king, Dom Pedro II, is ruling in conjunction with the large landowners. Kind of reminds you of feudal Europe, right? The arrangements of medieval and feudal Europe. But what is happening over the course of this century? What's going on over the course of this century? We're in the 19th century. This is the rise of what? This is the century of commercialization, industrialization, capitalism, the growth of commerce, of rising world wealth, and the growth of the middle class. These are the people who are not basing their wealth on land, they're basing their wealth on things like commerce, trade, industry, banking. They're not out in some far-flung province, managing what is in effect a massive farm, right? They're in the cities, and they're developing businesses, Creating factories. Well, they don't have a say in the political system. And what happens, we talked about this in our very first lecture. If the political and economic power and the military power are all in the same hands, you're going to have a pretty stable situation. Might not be fair or just in the sense that things could be very bad for the majority of people, but it's going to be fairly stable. Situations you could think of, like China, for example, maybe back in the 80s, where the political, economic, and military power was all held by the CCP. And even though the majority of the people of the country, a billion of them, were hopelessly, horribly poor, they rose up, the government killed a bunch of them, and things immediately settled down. It's just going to be a very stable system. What happens, though, when you start to see a divergence between who has the political power and then who has the economic power and who has the military power? When those things start to get disjointed, that's when regimes become unstable. And this is exactly what's happening to the Brazilian monarchy over the course of the 19th century, as you have all of these commercial middle-class bourgeois elites who want a say in how the state is being run, but they are not being consulted. The army has great sympathy for these people, because the army is a vehicle of mobility and advancement. It is a career that is open to talent. It is a way for someone of humble origins or of middle-class background to really rise to a position of importance. And they tend to see themselves, in the case of like Brazil, or Turkey was another good example of this, as sort of guardians of the state. That they're looking out for the state's best interest. That political rulers can be very foolish and stuff, and if things get out of line, we're going to step in and take over. So, large sectors of the Brazilian population are becoming disaffected, disgusted with the monarchy. Intellectuals, people like Comtean positivists, who are looking around and saying, we need to start applying reason and logic and embracing the advances of the 19th century, which of course the landed elite are resisting. Business people in the coastal towns, they're unhappy. Army officers, remember, they were being schooled in the positivist philosophy in the military academies. They all want modernization. And so in 1889, a military coup ends the monarchy and introduces the republic. Once again, without firing a shot. That's one of the really interesting things about Brazil, is if you look at it on a timeline like this, I didn't put all the coups on there. There's so many different coups and changes of power, but you'd think, wow, this thing's built on, tons of political violence. Not really. Not really. A lot of times when they would displace, Dom Pedro I, nobody got killed. Dom Pedro II, nobody got killed. When Vargas is removed, the only one who dies, I believe, is Vargas, who shoots himself. And then Goulart, same way. I believe the only one who died was Goulart because he shot himself. So very interesting, because when we get to the other Latin American dictatorships, the military dictatorships, like in Chile and Argentina, we're talking, they kill like 30,000 people. They just round up people and put them in the soccer stadiums and torture and kill them. Not that no one got tortured and killed in Brazil over the course of the period of the dictatorships of the military, but just to say it was, relatively speaking, very, very moderate by comparison. And this is something that goes all the way back to the 19th century. It was very bloodless changes of power, unlike the cases of their other Latin American neighbors, which were very violent and very bloody. Let's see, where are we now? So the First Republic. So it wasn't obviously called the First Republic. They didn't say, we are founding the First Republic, because that implies there's going to be lots of republics. This was just the Republic. Since the Republic didn't last, spoiler alert, since the Republic didn't last, retrospectively, historians have tended to call this government here either the First Republic or the Old Republic. It's a period that sees tremendous growth. They introduced a new constitution. Total, we're going to see something like, how many constitutions? They've had like 12 or 13 different constitutions. They write a new one here. Brazil's 1891 constitution, modeled after the United States, but power is going to be in the hands of the state-level political bosses. Remember, we had sort of a de facto federalism growing out of the 1830s when the crown was very weak and the military removed him and essentially sent power down to the federal states, which were dominated by the large, hacendados, the landowners, the plantation owners. Well, when the federal structure is officially codified in this new constitution here, you're essentially going to have power in the hands of the military and then in the hands of those local political elites. So, the presidency alternates between the dominant political bosses of the two most prominent states in Brazil, which if you look here on your map on 395, you will see them here, of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. Essentially here, the problem is you're going to have a lot of failed attempts at modernization. Because the problem here is that, I shouldn't say it like that. Well, just so you know, I don't care, how that thing worked out. I just mean, if you're thinking in terms of how do you modernize the state, which was the ostensible goal of the people who wanted to modernize the state, this was a failure because what happened is it left power essentially in the hands of the people who had not really wanted change in the first place, right? So yes, now you do have representative bodies and stuff, but power is essentially bouncing back and forth between these two large cliques in these two states, and neither one of them are all that interested in further democratizing Brazil, in further industrializing Brazil, and what happens is essentially Brazil stays a raw materials exporter. Brazil had been a big sugar exporter. It's going to become a big coffee exporter. Brasilia wood, that's where the name of the country comes from, actually. What's going to destroy the old republic is the Depression, the collapse of world trade. Actually, it's ironic that we say that today because today was, of course, Liberation Day. Did anyone listen to Liberation Day speech from the Rose Garden? No. Well, this might have been a momentous day. We'll wait and see. But essentially, tariffs. Tariffs go up all over the world. And it completely brings world trade to a grinding halt. That level of trade will not be reached again until the 1980s. This is a problem if you are a large agricultural exporter. You need export markets. And so the price of coffee collapses, and essentially what's going to happen here is Getulio Vargas is going to take power into his own hands with the help of the military, basically arguing that the politicians are corrupt, venal, they don't represent the people, and that I, your hero, you may place all of your faith in me. I'm going to create Estado Novo, the new state, a corporatistic welfare state, where business is going to work in conjunction with the state to slowly modernize and improve the society and economy, while the government takes care of your needs with welfare. So this is Getulio Vargas. He is a populist strongman. We talked about the caudillos, the strongman. They're very hard to put a label on because they aren't really leftist or rightist in the sense that, they're right-wing because they're culturally conservative, but, then aren't they sort of left-wing because they want to have tight state control of the economy? So I don't really think it's helpful to think of them in terms of left-right. I think it's proper to think of them as being populists. They essentially try to speak directly to the people and say, look, I am going to try and use the tools of the state to better your lot. I don't need any participation. I'm just going to do this on your behalf. They expand the economy by statist means. They they claim to speak for the people, institute welfare measures. They'll usually create a labor movement. This is a very common tool used. And in fact, it's a tool that's going to be used very successfully in Brazil and in other Latin American cases. You create a labor union that you can essentially control, rather than allowing a labor union to grow up in opposition to you, which is highly problematic if you are trying to be, El Presidente. So you create a pliant union that you can then work together with. So they give these groups, privileged status, nice welfare state. They concentrate power in themselves, though, and they treat political opponents quite brutally. If you are non-political, there's not going to be a problem. If you are just, for example, in China today, you can go about and do really whatever you want as far as business, relations, all that stuff, as long as you are not criticizing the regime and trying to incite political unrest. That's where the line gets drawn in states like this. There is no freedom of expression. There is no such thing as loyal opposition. So, yes, the problem here in Brazil and in elsewhere is that these populists, rather than building really strictly ideological parties and durable institutions, is they create kind of a cult of personality around themselves. And this is a big problem. I mentioned it in the context of Russia, that Russia's institutions are very weak, and that it is essentially a state run by Putin. I mentioned this in the context of China, that Xi Jinping, I think, is doing something a little bit dangerous and perhaps unwise in breaking with these precedents of his predecessors. In the case of Brazil, when we get to the modern day, which will be there in about 10 minutes, we're going to find that essentially politics has morphed into a contest between two personalities, Bolsonaro and Lula. And that these guys kind of stand as representatives of their movement. What's their movement? Where are their policy differences? Well, it's kind of hard to see, honestly. When we get there, we'll see that. Not that there's no differences, there are, but it's much more personalistic. So, Vargas, he's going to be the one who is ruling in the 1830s right here. Sorry, whoops. These are the states here. So, as you can see, very nice federal structures, very, very good for a state like this. The 1930s, this is when Vargas is in power. I had to truncate this because I had put all the different military coups that are coming. I would have had to use several pages. And I don't think that's terribly important to go through all of them, but essentially, there's going to be material progress under Vargas. He's essentially directing all the resources of the state and working together with industry to accomplish things like the building of highways, the setting up of social welfare systems, building hospitals, building schools. He was very friendly to U.S. investments. The U.S. was pretty cool with him. The military, though, eventually grows alarmed by Vargas's popularity, and they force him to resign in 1945. He makes a comeback, though. Because he's so popular. And in Perón does the same thing in Argentina. But Vargas is dealing with some very difficult stuff when he comes back. Corruption, inflation. He's forced to resign again in 1954. He commits suicide, as I had mentioned. One of his lieutenants, though, who eventually joins his cabinet, Goulart, João Goulart, he's the labor minister. He is eventually going to come to lead the country. And this is, so the 1950s, we're into the 1960s here. What happens here is Goulart comes to take the presidency, and the army doesn't like this because he's very much a leftist. And the army doesn't like this. This is the Cold War. Brazil's a very important country. They have a very close working relationship with the United States. A compromise gets worked out. Goulart can be president, but with powers of that office greatly curtailed. So the military is stepping in here again. Goulart accepts it, plays a waiting game, and then in 1963, he essentially calls a plebiscite and has the Brazilian people vote to give him back all the full powers of the presidency so that he can deal with all of these economic problems. And he has a solution for it. You know what he's going to do? He's going to redistribute land. Brazil then as now was one of the most unequal countries in the Americas. Population is exceedingly poor, except for very, very few at the top who are exceedingly wealthy, which we'll talk about. So land redistribution. He wants to nationalize the oil industry, which we talked about. That's that. Legalizing the Communist Party. No. The military is not going to put up with this. They get the nod from Washington, and they push him out. Again, hardly anyone dies. Except Goulart. The military is going to step in here, though. 64. So 1964, this is an important year, 1964. So from the 1930s to 1964, you have repeated periods of civilian rule, then the military steps in. Then the civilian rule, then the military steps in. Every 10 years this is happening. In 1964, they step in for a long interregnum. They do not give up power until 1984-85. So this was a much longer, this was the longest gap in civilian rule in Brazil. Again, going all the way back to its early independence as a kingdom in the 1820s. Within a decade, the army had stepped in. And then the army stepped in repeatedly, periodically, about every 20 years or so. But they always very quickly would return power to the civilian government. Essentially, and there's a great illustration here on page, where is it? I thought this was a very good structural depiction of this. If you want to take a look at it. Yes, 412. 412. That essentially the population would get very agitated. They would get very agitated. The economy is bad, or something. They're very upset. The military will step in, clamp down, suppress all the discontent and social issues. Then, over the course of a couple of years, they slowly release that pressure, allow civil society to reemerge, allow the political process to get restarted, and then the political process of civilian rule resumes. And so that's on page 412, if you want to take a look at that about halfway down. It's a good illustration here. They do not do this in this case. This is a very long period of military rule. They do do some torturing and do kill a few people during this period. Actually, Dilma Rousseff, who is going to become the first female president of Brazil. She's elected in 2010, I believe it was. She actually was one of the people who was tortured and in prison. So these people are here with us today. Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who just lost the election a couple of years ago and is now on trial for allegedly attempting a coup. He was an army officer during this period. So so this is a very formative time in Brazil's political experience. The army attempts a long period of decompression. What they do, and I like that he's always trying to, Roskin is always trying to give China some lessons, right? And he points to China here. He says, China might consider Brazil's transition to democracy as a model. The generals who ruled Brazil from 1964 to 1985 implemented a gradual period of decompression that gradually allowed freer media and two moderate parties to debate some matters in Parliament, provided they did not attack the ruling junta of the generals. The two parties were, to be sure, somewhat artificial, but they served a useful purpose in gradually opening up to a free and democratic multi-party system. So, it's an interesting idea, right? That you essentially introduce these sort of puppet parties who are going to debate things to get people used to the idea of open policy debates, and then the idea of parties that you can vote for, and then gradually you allow that to happen. So very interesting there. Democracy is reinstituted there. There have been periods where there was fear that the military would step back in. They have not. They have not. The 1990s provided them many opportunities to potentially do so. Brazil's economy in the 1990s, they suffered a multiplicity of currency crises. They went through several different currencies simultaneously. They had a lot of development issues. It marked the birth of an actual outside labor party that was going to be with us all the way to the start of our story, called the PT. This is the party of the workers, the leftist party, which in your lifetimes has been wholly dominated by Lula da Silva, who was actually just released from prison recently, and is now the president of Brazil again. But I'll get to that part of the story. So that's when the PT gets formed. So they're actually allowing an actual labor party to participate, a radical communist labor party to participate in politics. And they don't eventually, they take power in the early 2000s. The initial winners of the elections are moderates. The initial winners are moderates. They start moving closer to the United States, trying to attract foreign direct investment, and this is during the 1990s. Lula wins in the early 2000s, and the initial fear is that he's going to be some kind of left-wing communist. But instead, what Lula does is, he kind of made his base really mad. His name is actually mud among a lot of hardcore leftists in Brazil today, because what he did is he said, look, the country is finally starting to grow prosperous because we embraced these free market policies during the late 1990s, and we started attracting foreign investment from the United States, and we made this a good place to set up industry, and we're trying to be a good, responsible trading partner and keep the debt down and stuff, because foreign investors were like, oh my gosh, they're going to start printing all this money and making all these welfare programs, and it's going to be a disaster, and he reassured them, and he reassured the Brazilian business community. Look, I might implement some small social welfare programs, but it's not going to be wholesale appropriations and really high taxes. And so he essentially became a center-left guy. He moved to the center. And his period of rule, he won 2 straight terms. He really benefited by the fact that the early 2000s were a time when commodity prices were soaring. So revenue was just pouring into the Brazilian state. And he is able to implement this very, very successful program called the Bolsa Familia. It's one of the most popular welfare programs anywhere in the world. And basically what it was a small allowance to make sure that families with children were getting enough food to eat. Because, I'm going to get into this, one of Brazil's biggest problems is economic inequality and insane amounts of poverty. I'll pull up a map here, just to kind of give you an idea. The Bolsa Familia, basically, if you're sending your kids to school, they check your attendance record, they give you a card, like this, right? And they check, are your kids going to school? And are they up to date on their immunizations? And things like that. And if they're doing that, then you keep getting this money. And the idea here is you want to incentivize keeping the kids on the right track to be able to be successful down the road. Now, if you look at Brazil, it's massive, right? It's absolutely huge. But the majority of the population, right along the coast, right? Not terribly surprising, right? The same thing is true in the United States. If you pull up a population density map, the coastal populations are much denser than the heartland populations. And then, of course, you have the urban-rural, divide as well. So, the population, these cities have many, many millions of people in there, and what you have are these things called favelas. Did you read about those in the book? Favelas? They're these enormous, like here's the city, right? Here's the city, and then on the outskirts of the city are these enormous permanent encampments of people who are poor, who don't have houses, who don't have jobs, they obviously try to make money doing odd jobs if there's a very large informal economy in Brazil and stuff, but the favelas, very, very desperately poor people. It's estimated that something like 33 million Brazilians face food insecurity on a daily basis. And food insecurity means you regularly don't have food to eat, which is actually critical. So, especially for children, during those early developmental years, there can be incredible long-term deleterious effects to not getting that. And Brazil's economy is it's still growing. It's not terribly sophisticated. There are all sorts of issues there, which I'm going to get into when we talk about the policy stuff. But just so you're aware, this program here was meant to address this right here, which is a huge problem. So, Bolsa Familia, it's extremely popular. He's able to pay for it without raising tons of taxes, which the business community would have hated, because of the fact that money is pouring into Brazil from all their phenomenal exports of raw materials that are happening during this early 2000s period. However, the PT, that's his party here, the Workers' Party, he serves 2 terms. The Constitution allows you to serve 2 terms, and then you have to leave office. After that, you can come back and run for president again, but you only get two consecutive terms. He handpicks his successor, Dilma Rousseff, who I had mentioned earlier. She was the one who was imprisoned and tortured by the junta. So she's his handpicked successor. Problem is, she takes power right as the world economy is about to go right in the dumpster, right? You kids are probably, you young people are too young to remember this maybe, but I remember in 2007, 2008, where it was like, is something about to go down here, Dad? You know, people seem very excited. I think I was 17 or something, 17, 18 at the time. And I mean, oh man, the next several years, it was horrible. And Brazil gets whacked. So Brazil's economy just goes in the tank. Dilma Rousseff is standing there holding the bag, and then the big scandal comes. And you can look this one up. It's called Operation Car Wash. So the PT came to power saying, we're going to help the poor who have always been left behind by the corrupt Brazilian elites who don't care about the people. They're just corrupt and self-serving. It was a big part of the PT's image, because when you poll Brazilians, consistently, what they say their number one thing that they hate and want the government to address is corruption. In 2013 to 2015, the Brazilian government is investigating, very quietly, what they believe is a money laundering operation. And one of the fronts that they find, you want to find a business that deals in cash, right? It says car wash. And so they bust the guy right in the act. And he winds up spilling the beans, right? He cuts a deal. He's like, listen, you go easy on me and I'll tell you what's really up. They find out that the PT has been laundering billions, with a B, billions of dollars, and siphoning them away to offshore accounts. It is the biggest corruption scandal in Latin American history. Believe me, there have been no shortage of those. But they were using the state oil company revenue to enrich themselves and their cronies. And it actually leads to Dilma Rousseff being impeached. And they connect Lula, the beloved labor leader, he was a simple shop worker. He had like 3 years of primary education. He was born to like a hopelessly poor family, grew up in a favela, a man of the people. Very damaging, very damaging. He actually winds up getting sentenced to prison. Gets thrown in prison. They gave him 12 years. And this was in 2017. He's thrown in prison. Yes, 2017. So he gets thrown in prison. So the PT, who had been ruling Brazil for over a decade at this point, all of a sudden their brand is dirt. And so is everyone who is connected with them. And this opens up a lane for the guy who had always hated the PT, who had always said they were a bunch of darn dirty leftist snakes and you can't trust them. They don't represent Brazil's traditional family values. They're just a bunch of commie leftists. This provides the opening for Jair Bolsonaro, who had been a backbencher conservative MP going all the way back to the 1990s. When I last mentioned him, he was a young officer for the junta in the 1970s. Well, he goes into politics, and in 1991, he gets elected. And he is just someone who really was very, very marginal for a long, long time. But one thing that he always did is he opposed the PT, opposed them. And so, with the PT mired in the biggest corruption scandal in Brazil, in Brazilian history, in Latin American history, this opens up a running lane for Bolsonaro, and he wins. And he wins. And so, Lula gets locked up. And, sorry. Lula gets locked up. Bolsonaro is in power. And what happens here is essentially the Brazilian Supreme Court, most of whose members have been appointed by the PT, decide to review Lula's case. And they decide that there have been some procedural abnormalities. Now you have to understand, in law, there are two questions here. Procedural and material facts. Procedural means, did you fill out form A, B, C, D, and did you submit it 2 weeks before the thing? It's just a series of steps, right? Then there are material facts. These are things like evidence. Did you see him steal the cookie from the jar? Yes, I did. I saw him. And then we found the cookie in his desk later, and so it all makes sense. Those are material facts. The Supreme Court of Brazil goes back and says, there were procedural abnormalities. We're going to kick this back down to the lower court. Then they decide that the statute of limitations on the crime, that means there's a period after which you can't try the crime. Lula winds up going free on what were called procedural technicalities. So it was not a material question at all. He did it. He definitely did it. But the court essentially said, there were procedural irregularities, and so he must go free. He is also eligible to run for the presidency. And so this sets up a head-to-head matchup between Bolsonaro and Lula. And it's the closest election in Brazilian history. And Lula, 2 years ago, edged him out by like 1%. 1%. I mean, this thing was razor close. Bolsonaro says, the election was fraudulent, it was fake, it was rigged, I'm not going to accept the results. He flees the country. He was actually in Miami, Florida. I was thinking, wow, I wonder if we'll run into him, because I had actually taken the kids down there for spring break, and then I opened up my phone, it's like, Jair Bolsonaro has fled to Miami. I was like, I wonder if, or Orlando, I'm like, oh, what? I wonder if he's around here somewhere. No, his supporters basically stormed the Brazilian parliament building and the presidential palace, kind of like a rerun of like January 6th type thing. And so then the Supreme Court says, Jair Bolsonaro, we think you're responsible for this. Basically, we're going to put you on trial for this. And the trial is due to start here soon. And he faces up to 40 years in prison because they say that he attempted to incite a coup against democracy, and that, and I won't pretend to know, I do not know what to make of that whole thing. I'll take a stop here in just a minute before we get to the institutions and stuff, but that's the political history. I did do quite a bit of reading on this, so I want to be able to give you some idea. He had ties to the military, obviously, and the defense minister essentially said, yes, someone from Bolsonaro's team came to me and said, hey, we think that this was rigged. We might need to step in. We might need you to step in and take control of the situation. And the defense minister said that he told Bolsonaro's team that under no conditions would the military be okay with a non-peaceful transfer of power taking place. Basically telling him, we are not going to step in. It's been, almost 40 years since the military stepped in. You lost this election. Maybe there were some abnormalities. I'm not an expert on Brazilian elections. I mean, there's always a little bit of funny business in every election. But basically saying, nope, we're not going to help you. You better not do it. We will not be on your side. And that was why Bolsonaro did not go for it. That is what I read as far as what the insiders say. That someone on his team basically approached them to feel out the military. Hey, would you take our side if we called you out against the PT and their people? And the military said, no, don't try it. And so that is the basis on which they're going to try him. And he faces up to 40 years. And this is no joke, man. Populist rightists have not had good luck. Has anyone been following the news cycle this week? Did you see who's going to be thrown in prison? Remember me talking to you about Marine Le Pen? The French right populist? Yep. She, a French court over the week, what day is it? Wednesday? Monday. Basically, they had said that her team mishandled some monies, and that there were some procedural issues. Paperwork wasn't filled out properly. The prosecutor asked the French judge to give Le Pen 2 years in prison. Judge came back and said, I'm going to give her 12 years in prison. And also, she cannot run for president. Yeah. And then, of course, you know that yeah, you know that the AfD in Germany is probably going to be ruled unconstitutional. I think that'll prompt a constitutional crisis in Germany. And then there was that rightist in what was it, Bulgaria? I forget. Was it Romania who won that? He was going to go into the runoff, and so they were like, cancel the election. Never mind. We talked about it in class. You brought it up because J.D. Vance had mentioned it in his speech. Yeah. Well, anyway, there you go. Politics is a contact sport, is what I'm saying. They play for keeps. So you know, for a long time in Brazil, the kind of unspoken rule, and Roskin mentions this in your book, was that look, everyone is getting their palm greased, from the lowest policeman to the toppest of the politicians, and nobody talk about it. Don't rat each other out. And because everybody's dirty, because everyone's got some corruption going on. Even Bolsonaro, who made a huge deal about the PT and their big corruption, like it was a huge corruption deal, but then it turned out that like there was some kind of abnormalities from back when he was a congressperson. So everybody was involved. And with the idea that now you're going to use it to weaponize it, to go after your opponents, anti-corruption campaigns, that's usually, in developing countries, that's usually a euphemism for political warfare. Like when Xi Jinping says he's engaged in anti-corruption or something like that. You can generally bet. He doesn't really have any dangerous rivals anymore, but bet 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago when he started doing that, it was like, you better watch out. And sure enough, one by one, they all got caught. Because everybody's doing it, right? The problem is that everyone is guilty, and so, if you're a problem, it's very easy for them to find a pretext to get rid of you. And what's worrying now is Bolsonaro is incredibly popular. Just like the AfD and the National Front, it's not like these are fringe politicians who had like 5% of the popular vote. These are people who are, Bolsonaro came within 1% of winning the presidency. He just held a rally, because he's free to like walk around Brazil, but he is on trial. He basically told his supporters, an election without me is a sham. It's a sham. It's not real democracy. And so, oh boy. Yeah, go ahead.
How can like the AfD be ruled unconstitutional?
Because the basic law, remember, the basic law, you'll see that on the final exam, that's the name of Germany's constitution, the basic law. The basic law essentially has a provision in there, and we went over it in class, so if you want to go back and watch that video, because I don't remember it off the top of my head. They basically have a provision in the constitution, in the basic law, that says any party which is deemed to be unfriendly toward democracy, and it's very loose language. It's not like there's no clear test, there's no clear line. It's going to go to the court. The court will decide what constitutes, not being supportive of democracy. And if you are ruled not to be supportive of German democracy, whatever that means, you can be ruled unconstitutional. And remember, it's been used twice. But in those cases, it was used to target very minor parts. It was used to target a literal Nazi party in the 50s, and then it was used to target a literal communist party. Both of the groups said like, we want the violent overthrow of the state. So it was like kind of a slam dunk there, pretty easy, and like they had very few supporters. The AfD is winning 30% of the popular vote and is just criticizing the EU and Brussels immigration policies and things like that. So could be very dangerous for German democracy there to rule them unconstitutional. I think locking up Marine Le Pen could be very dangerous there because her second man, I forget his name, Morella, I think his name is, he could still run. And what if he wins and decides, okay, you want to play that way? Fine. And he starts trying to lock up, members of like the Renaissance Party, which is Macron's group. And again, so like then what if Bolsonaro is ruled unconstitutional and, but someone in his movement takes power, and so you don't really want that. You don't want that. You don't want politics to become a game that's played to that extreme. Because that's when democratic order breaks down. When you're playing for keeps, democracy just can't last. You have to be willing to moderate your aims, to be willing to accept losing, to accept not getting everything you want, and being willing to play the game the next day. So moderation is absolutely necessary. But the polarization of politics around the world and in places like Brazil are a real danger, especially when you have a very weak institutional history like Brazil. So take 5-10 minutes, and when we come back, we'll go over Brazil's institutions and how everything functions in Brazil, because that's the political history up to this point. Bolsonaro is going to go on trial, the former president. Lula, he is back in the presidency.